For over 35 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we want to examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is BILD Situation Room. We begin with footage from southeastern Ukraine. There, the Russian army has taken control of the small town of Velyka Novosilka. We're reviewing footage that has been released by the Russian Ministry of Defense over the past few days. These are pictures we've often seen entirely destroyed downtown areas right at the heart of this small town. However, the Russian flag flies in the different neighborhoods that can be seen here. We see Velyka Novosilka. It was a dramatic escape by the Ukrainian army. As we can see here, this is the Mokry River and it flows halfway around the town. This implies the Ukrainians had to attempt to make their escape through this river. That's what they apparently did, as reported this morning by The Economist and other insiders. However, it's unclear whether they had to swim or if small paddle boats were provided. We now see the city in the background completely under Russian control, and we can also see the different flags that the Russian brigades have set up here. The stadium of the city, naturally, has experienced several impacts. We just saw the grass on the football field, which is a bit battered. Yet, at this point, it's not really that important anyway, because there are hardly any people remaining in the city. Certainly, we can take another look at that scene. It clearly illustrates once again just how very imprecise and inaccurate the mortar fire from the Russian artillery in this area actually is. So those definitely didn't hit any targets, but instead they're all rockets that landed to the left and right of the intended targets. As a result, the city appears accordingly, with numerous rooftops visibly damaged. Yes, that's not the case here at the moment. However, we can see that the majority of the residents no longer live there, having fled, and maybe a few dozen stayed to the very end, enduring amidst the ruins here, to wait for, in quotes, naturally the so-called savior Vladimir Putin and his army. It was otherwise a situation, as mentioned, that was very critical for the Ukrainian army. We now see the map of Velyka Novosilka, and we had already seen in the past weeks that the city was surrounded on three sides. In the northern part, Nowy Koma was captured approximately a month ago, and in the southern region, Russian forces gradually progressed their way forward up to Vremivka. This area ultimately fell into their hands over the last few days. The issue for the Ukrainians was that in Vremivka, the last bridge remained under their control. And when this bridge was no longer there, as we might see a little bit here, the Mokry had to be crossed without any bridge being available, meaning either by swimming through the water or using small paddle boats for the crossing. The evacuation likely happened over the weekend, so that's good news for the Ukrainian army. They didn't allow themselves to be surrounded here, but instead, as insiders report, they waited until a heavy fog, a thick fog, lay over the city and then escaped, as best as they could. There are some recordings showing that, unfortunately, wounded soldiers had to be left behind in the field hospitals. They either died or fell into Russian hands. However, this may only involve a handful of soldiers. The encirclement of several hundred was once again prevented, which is something very important for the Ukrainian army, as we all know how significant the personnel, the infantry problems, especially those of Ukraine, are. From Donetsk, we move to Kursk in western Russia, and we have some very impressive footage here that once again shows the unbelievable number of tanks and armored personnel carriers the Russian army used here, but unsuccessfully deployed, without actually making significant progress. These are recordings that perhaps haven't existed in such totality and completeness before. So what we have here is a road, and it's a road that leads in the direction of Ukrainian occupied territory. And we see at all these locations here everywhere destroyed Russian tanks. Every single one of them is Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, especially of the BMD-2 and BMD-4 types, particularly from the airborne troop types that have been deployed in recent months to repeatedly storm the area. And we can see it's really an enormous amount. I have checked throughout the entire video, and there are more than 30 vehicles visible, all lying along that single road. And we can clearly observe that this is just one specific location where the Russians made an attempt to advance further, where they failed to achieve success, leading to the loss of dozens of vehicles and hundreds of soldiers on this particular road alone. Nevertheless, where they want to go, namely Malaya Loknya, this place from where the whole thing is filmed from the air, is still under Ukrainian control. That means they couldn't capture it. We also see that these dragon's teeth are set up here. I don't think it was the Ukrainians who laid it or the Russians who laid it. The Ukrainian army has been present here since August, so it would indeed have been the right time. In any case, it all ultimately led to the Russian army having only one way to advance here. And we see at the end, the last Russian vehicle essentially got stuck right between these dragons' teeth. Therefore, the path is now effectively blocked for the other Russians who face either the danger of mines or predominantly the threat of kamikaze attacks, as they were destroyed by the Ukrainian army in that area. The Road of Death, a very dreadful name, is what the Ukrainians call this road we see here. and we can now clearly see the reasons why. Nevertheless, this should not obscure the fact that there are also Ukrainian losses continuing to occur in the Kursk region. However, these are significantly fewer. The Russians typically post every single video of a tank that gets hit. And now we're going to see how a Ukrainian tank like this one is actually hunted down by Russian kamikaze drones. Again, these special drones with the fiber optic link. That's why we see this very clear image. We observe, though, this could make it considerably more precise during its final approach. Plus, the Russian drone operator is also assured that the drone indeed did hit, without these interference being visible everywhere. Still, they are not more effective. We can see here how a single T-64 of the Ukrainian army is being followed, and indeed. Towards Sverdlikovo. Sverdlikovo, one of 3 larger villages still under Ukrainian control. We're observing the drones striking continuously. Right now we can see one approaching. From the back you can see it well again, so it follows the tank around the corner and then flies straight in. Despite that, the explosion we continuously observe doesn't really show that the tank has been taken out, much less the crew inside being impacted or affected in any significant way. We'll subsequently see how the crew disembarks after approximately 3 or 4 hits from Russian kamikaze drones, abandons the tank, and eventually, now we're observing additional hits here, which were subsequently struck by another drone from the Russians and ultimately destroyed. This very clearly demonstrates to us once more just how many drones are truly needed to effectively destroy just a single tank. Now we see it here, the scenes from just now, very briefly. So the Ukrainian crew disembarks. That means all 3 soldiers exit the tank. Apparently there are no injuries. And now the Russians keep going on. We see it here from the right. The approach is always behind the turret. That's always the point of entry that's attempted because that's where the engine compartment is. If someone tries to trigger that catastrophic explosion from there, since the next explosion, which then hits the tower and more continue, and in the end we actually see how after about 5 or 6 or 7 Russian drones, each costing around 1,000 euros, that's still significantly less than the tank. Nevertheless, we'll see that this entire tank explodes. So in the end, we have an ammunition explosion and then also the end of this abandoned tank in the field of Sverdlikovo. However, as we can see here, the Russian drones, in this particular case, if you will, offer an honest recording, not nearly as much. Successful and effective, as some say, claiming these fiber optic controlled drones are a kind of wonder weapon. That's not the case, and also for that reason, Ukrainian soldiers have told us that they are not completely switching to fiber optics, but continue to use the FPV drones controlled by radio signals, in the majority of cases at least. Just briefly back to what we just saw. The first was the road that led approximately along here. This was the so-called Road of Death towards Malaya Lochnia, which was utilized by the Russians, which was also partially conquered by them, but ultimately the objective was not captured. And the second thing we saw was the Russian attack on this Ukrainian tank here in Sverdlikovo. And when we look at the whole thing, even in terms of dimensions, it's really not much anymore. So we only have a width of approximately 20 kilometers from here and a length of maybe around 30 kilometers. So it is a relatively small area still held by the Ukrainians. We recall back in August last year, the Ukrainians advanced all the way to Korenevo and were also directly connected to Vishnevka here. They even managed to push as far as Giri at the beginning and had stationed troops there at least for some time. Much of it has been retaken by the Russian army. Still, Putin's goal before Donald Trump took office was to control the situation. This goal was not achieved at all, but the Russians continue to fight. The Russians continue to lose an extremely high number of men and tanks, and that's precisely why the Ukrainian army remains stationed in Kursk. From Kursk, we return to Ukraine, specifically to the Donetsk region once more. That's where most of the fighting is taking place, and we see a Ukrainian HIMARS attack on a high-tech radar system of the Russian army. We see the video that was just recorded by the Ukrainian army, and we can also see displayed what kind of system it is, namely one with the complicated name, 96L6E. And what it entails is a very modern radar system that can classify and identify targets in the airspace and then relay this information, these data, to the S-300 and S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems of the Russian army. Such a system is not in operation here. The radars, of course, also work independently, and accordingly, the Russians apparently intended to monitor the Ukrainian airspace by dispatching a single 96L6E unit here to easily monitor where the Ukrainians are moving and to be adequately forewarned in response. We can now clearly see how the radar system is being stationed here in this particular forest clearing. The Ukrainians are observing all this with a surveillance drone and are now ordering the HIMARS strike. Now, from a maximum distance of 85 kilometers, we can see the impact on this system here. What you don't hear now sound, the Ukrainians are extremely pleased with the impact as it hits the system with meter precision, hitting the sensitive radar we see here. And here we see, it's quite clear to identify, here is the extended radar that was active. Here below is essentially the moving unit. And the whole thing is smoking right here. That means we can see that the impact occurred right there, where all the technology and where the radar system worth 15 million euros was set up. The Russian forces can't use this radar system anymore. We stay in Donetsk and head to the Pokrovsk region, a region with a city of 65,000 residents that the Russian army is eager to capture. And here we have a Ukrainian counterattack on the ground. We can see here how a Bradley is being deployed, an infantry fighting vehicle supplied by the USA. And we can also see the thermal images. That's why we can quite well understand what's happening here, specifically at night. This is a small counterattack on a village that was just taken by the Russians. And especially focusing on these systems we see here, that means these enormous trench systems that were actually dug by the Ukrainians but then had to be abandoned because there simply weren't enough men to defend the whole thing against the Russians. Below we see the Bradley vehicle, and we'll soon observe the infantry disembarking while the Bradley fires at targets, actively engaging, and shortly we will see the Ukrainians trying, both in the village houses and facilities, to get active here. In parallel, it's a bit hard to see. There is an attack by a Ukrainian drone. You can see it here. So it is. A hexacopter here, quite a large Baba Yaga drone that drops bombs on the Russians who are taking shelter inside the houses there. And now we're able to see it, the explosion and the drone. We glanced right. You might see it again briefly. So the drone flew away. It wasn't just that the drone exploded, but it was a heavy bomb that it dropped. The Ukrainians utilized this strategy, deploying drones for aerial surveillance from above, the Baba Yaga, the Bradley as backup, and the infantry forces. Who's going out now is trying to liberate this facility, this large defense complex here, from Russian soldiers. But the whole thing is again a so-called search and destroy mission. So you go in, you find the Russians, you kill the Russians, and you get out again. It's not a classic counterattack where you say, okay, then it's our land again, and we shall defend it once more. We notice the huge structures the Ukrainians spent so long constructing. And yet we have perhaps all in all 10 soldiers of infantry from Ukraine deployed here. That means there are also far too few soldiers to hold the whole thing. You go in there, attempt to free it from the Russians, if you will, and then quickly retreat again with the Bradley, because both the infantry fighting vehicle and the soldiers are very important, and you definitely don't want to lose them. This is, as I said, the Pokrovsk region. We'll take a quick look at the map to see that the front there has at least somewhat, well, I don't want to say come to a standstill, but is progressing somewhat more slowly. We remember that during the past several weeks and months, the Russian forces have at times, for example, managed to cover the distance starting from this location, from Shevchenko to Udachne, over a duration of roughly around 4 weeks or so. So that was almost 10 kilometers, and the fear was if they had covered another 10 kilometers or even just 5 kilometers, they would have made it in a very short time to this dashed line border here. That's the next oblast of the central Ukrainian region, Dnipropetrovsk. The Russians would have made it there at the same speed. However, the Ukrainian defense is currently so robust and strong that at least the advance toward the west has been effectively halted, and it's been this way for approximately 2 weeks already. It isn't progressing any further here, nor is the advance in the direction towards Pokrovsk. At least Pokrovsk could be slowed down. We know the Russians are now moving here over Kotlin, attempting to advance along the railway. They're managing it, but much slower than in the weeks before. The city of Pokrovsk, with its 65,000 inhabitants, and its neighboring city Mirnorad, which once had 45,000 residents, both remain firmly under complete Ukrainian control. This means that these worst-case scenarios, which had somewhat been hinted at over Christmas, did not occur here, nor in both larger cities defended by Ukraine. The situation is different in Toretsk, where a city of 30,000 inhabitants was lost to the Russian army after a very long battle, which lasted about 6 months. And we have new footage showing us Toretsk, but only from the outside. Namely, what the Ukrainians are trying to do now, the Russians who have entrenched themselves there are now trying to move their drone depots and all their ammunition depots to Toretsk to then keep pushing further west, allowing these depots to be targeted by the Ukrainian military. Let's take a look at the recordings and see that at this moment, these are the recordings. Also quite interesting to always see these huge spoil heaps here. Toretsk was also a mining town, and we see these volcano-like spoil heaps that were built up here, representing everything that was extracted from the ground by the Ukrainian miners. Now we see how this entire area is under Russian control. That means the Ukrainians are observing this, and now they're coming with their 155mm artillery stationed outside the city, a Ukrainian artillery named Bodana, and these are units of the police unit Lyud, which is also fighting here now. And we can see here how it's being shelled by this Bodana onto Toretsk. That means you identify the targets beforehand. Observe where the Russians are moving within Toretsk, and then you proceed to strike with these grenades. And because we also see what kind of truly massive apartment blocks these are, which were captured in Toretsk and have slipped from Russian control, we are now able to observe that the target has been identified further down, with Russians being spotted by means of the drone, and currently a direct attack is being executed there in an attempt to accomplish certain objectives. However, the entire truth also encompasses the fact that these are indeed solid structures, large buildings, which had been shelled by the Russians even before they captured them. And that is, of course, extremely difficult there to kill individual soldiers, because every wall naturally provides protection. And even if an explosion that occurs just a few meters away from a Russian soldier here, as long as there is a wall in between them and the houses provide adequate protection, it remains relatively safe for the Russians to move from point A to point B. Quite different from, for example, in open terrain, where naturally a 155mm shell creates, so to speak, a kill zone in every direction within 10 or 15 meters distance. That's completely different in the city. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians have to do something now that they've lost Toretsk, so that the Russians don't continue to advance there. Further attacks towards the west can be prepared. We go from Donetsk to Kharkiv in the northeastern Ukrainian region, and here we also look at new footage from the Achilles Battalion of the Ukrainian Army's 92nd Brigade. And we see how the Russians continue to move forward with their vehicles, in this case, vehicles of the type BTR-82A and BTR-80. Also BTR-82A, a modern infantry fighting vehicle evolved from the BTR-80, which here, however, from this battalion, Achilles are attacking one after another. We see that this is a completely different quality regarding the impacts, so also concerning the transmissions. We see that these blips keep appearing, and the signal gets worse as the drone descends, getting closer to its target. That's simply due to the fact that the radio signal, the broadcast signal, becomes increasingly weaker as you get closer to the ground, with these, if you will, traditional factors at play, and that's also carefully put, since they've only existed for 2 years. These traditional FPV drones are used to destroy Russian tanks and armored vehicles. We see here, nonetheless, it also requires several impacts. However, it ultimately leads to the destruction of all attacked BTR armored personnel carriers, wheeled armor vehicles, the ones the Russians used here. And what we cut out, we do this very often because it's just very, very graphic and very brutal. Of course, all these armored personnel carriers were also filled with infantrymen, and these infantrymen tried to take cover after their vehicles were taken out and were then also attacked by the Ukrainians. That means what we just saw, if you will, was the left part of what was shown here at the end, namely how 3 BTR-82 and 1 BTR-80 were destroyed. What we didn't see is how some of the crew, namely 3, were killed and 4 wounded on the Russian side. This aspect was actually visible in the video as well. Nonetheless, I do believe in this specific case, it's sufficient to consistently emphasize that, of course, crews are there, infantrymen are there, and that at the end of the attacks on the vehicles, the attacks on the various personnel follow, which then also leads to the casualty numbers, which we see right now on the Russian side. Over 100 deaths in Ukraine every day. Finally, we would like to take another look at the skies above Ukraine. We have now obtained some new footage from the 95th Brigade of the Ukrainian Army, showing us how, yes, under a relatively idyllic or in front of a relatively idyllic landscape in winter, even if we see these impact craters everywhere, large drones, Russian drones, are being attacked and completely destroyed. Here we can clearly observe that this is an X-wing, if you will, even a double X-wing. We see that both the large and the small ones of the Sala Lancet type are being attacked here. Those are kamikaze drones of the Russian army with a range of about 70 kilometers. In that sense, a very potent weapon that the Ukrainians are targeting here. And then we observe the Sala 421 being targeted. Shortly after, we see these Manta Ray or Stingray-like Sala Supercam 350 drones, which possess an even greater operational range than the other drones, making them extremely effective and truly formidable in their capabilities. Very Good surveillance drones used by the Russian side to see where the Ukrainian units are, where they are preparing or adjusting, where artillery strikes, and determine where we need to hit with our air force or rocket units. Therefore, it's extremely important to take these drones out of the sky. Ukraine has for about half an hour here, while another Lancet is being shot down for about half a year naturally. She has the ability to use small FPV drones to chase these drones and bring them down from the sky. This is extremely important and highly efficient for Ukraine because, as I mentioned, a very small drone is being used, which costs at maximum up to 1,000 euros. The target that was shot down here on the other side, and we can run it again if needed, has a value ranging between 30,000 and 70,000 euros. Consequently, this is very significant for Ukraine. And of course, you also need the right data and also information. You need the information on where the enemy drones are moving. And from my own experience, I can say that the Ukrainians are extremely well informed and can even, in some cases, do so in real time, tell where the Russian kamikaze drones are moving over this vast country, twice the size of Germany. And therefore, it becomes possible for them to launch their small FPV drones effectively with this excellent information. And yes, it's absolutely clear that you have to locate your destination within 15, at most 20 minutes. Otherwise, the small drones will crash again. To prevent that, the Ukrainians rely on information, as mentioned, that shows them where the Russian drones are. And these drones are then rammed out of the sky one by one.